When Marcus Grant stepped out of the sleek black car, his mind was tangled with chaotic thoughts. It was a gloomy April morning, and the weak light filtering through the dense clouds did nothing to dispel the anxiety rising within him. Riverside was a city unremarkable for anything except its unsolved cases, and its vague sense of tranquility masked the crimes its residents never dared to confront. Today, Marcus was not entering the city as a visitor, but as a man on a mission to tackle one of the biggest issues within the Riverside Police Department. Today was Marcus's first day as chief of police. He knew the road ahead would be far from easy, and what he was about to do could shake an entire broken system. Riverside was drowning in corruption, racism, and a police culture that had, for far too long, been an excuse for bad actors to thrive. But despite the challenges looming before him, he remained resolute. He could not turn a blind eye to what was happening under his watch. That was why he had chosen a different approach. No formal meetings, no flowery introductions, just a raw, unfiltered reality check. Marcus was a black man, and he knew that even though he had climbed to this position, he would never be treated the same as his white colleagues. He had been a cop before, had faced racism from the very first days of his career. But today, he was no ordinary officer. He was the head of a police department, and his job was to clean out this poisoned institution. As he stepped into the station, he noticed the curious glances, the subtle sideways looks from the officers around him. Though it was his first day here, it was no surprise that no one paid him much attention. They didn't know who he was, and that was exactly what Marcus wanted. He wanted them to see him as just another man, not the new chief of police. He wanted to observe what they truly thought of men like him, without the mask of rank or power. The new chief walked into the large lobby of the station. The scene inside was all too familiar. Desks cluttered with paperwork, the cold fluorescence of overhead lights, and an atmosphere thick with something heavy, something he knew all too well. It was a space these officers had long grown accustomed to, a space where crime and corruption seeped into every corner. Marcus walked straight through without a word. The officers at their desks barely glanced at him, their indifference making it clear they had no idea who he was. And he wasn't in a hurry to reveal himself. He stopped in the hallway, listening to the conversations around him. Everything seemed normal. Casual chatter about last night's football game, trivial stories that had nothing to do with work. But then, as he neared the break room, a sharp voice cut through his thoughts. "Hey, what are you looking for?" Marcus turned to see a white officer, a man who seemed quite sure of his place in the department, approaching him. The look in his eyes was full of contempt, as if he were seeing someone who didn't belong. "This isn't your place. Get out," the officer said mockingly. Marcus forced himself to stay calm. He knew better than to react in anger, but the words echoed in his mind. Being dismissed and judged based on his skin color was nothing new, but it was never easy to face. "It's fine. I'm just looking for the break room," Marcus replied, his voice steady. But the officer didn't back off. He stepped closer, shaking his head with a condescending smirk. "This place isn't for people like you," the officer sneered. "This whole department has enough of your kind already." The words hit like a slap, but what came next was even worse. Before Marcus could react, the officer spat in his face. The room went silent. Time seemed to freeze for a few seconds, and in that moment, Marcus felt something inside him shatter. The warm spit clung to his skin, and the sound of laughter from nearby officers made the humiliation even worse. They weren't just laughing at the act. They saw it as a joke. To them, Marcus was just another man, a nobody who had no right to be here. Shame and fury boiled inside him, but he refused to let it show. Instead, he calmly reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and slowly wiped his face, steadying his emotions. Then he met the officer's gaze, his eyes filled with unshakable resolve. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks in here?" Marcus asked, his voice low and measured. The officer simply smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong," he replied before turning and walking away. Marcus said nothing more. He turned and walked down the hallway, heading straight for the main conference room. He could feel the tension in the air as he entered. Every pair of eyes was now locked on him, not with respect, but with skepticism and challenge. But Marcus knew this was the moment to act. These officers didn't know who he was, but they would. When he stepped into the meeting room, a heavy silence filled the space. Everyone was waiting, watching, but no one dared to speak. This wasn't just the first day of a new police chief. This was the beginning of a revolution in the Riverside Police Department, and Marcus was ready for the fight. After the incident that morning, Marcus felt something he had anticipated but never expected to come so quickly. Even though he was the new police chief, even though he had stepped into a position of power here within the walls of the Riverside Police Department, he was still an outsider. Every step he took, every action, every decision was met with cold, piercing stares, gazes sharper than any weapon. As soon as Marcus stepped through the doors of the police department on his second day of work, he knew that not everything he would face was just about the job. Behind the fake smiles and polite greetings, an underground force was waiting for the opportunity to prove that change would not come easily. And he was the first target of that resistance. That morning, as he entered the workspace, the atmosphere once again grew heavy. The officers sat silently at their desks, their gazes no longer filled with curiosity as they had been on the first day, but instead had transformed into sharp, suspicious looks. They no longer bothered to hide their hostility. One officer sitting near the door eyed Marcus with clear disdain, saying nothing but making his disapproval obvious. Another officer, whom Marcus had briefly spoken to the day before, passed by him without making eye contact, but the slight smirk on his face was enough to signal that resistance had begun. Marcus was no stranger to these looks, to these subtle signs of defiance. He entered his office without showing any hesitation or concern. However, he could not ignore the fact that in every gesture, in every word spoken by these people, there was something familiar, an ingrained racism, one that was difficult to pinpoint if judged only by appearances. That morning passed in strange silence. When Marcus tried to engage with some of the officers to review reports and ongoing cases, he noticed hesitation in each interaction. They responded to him coldly, showing none of the openness he had encountered among colleagues in other departments. They seemed to be deliberately keeping their distance from him, an invisible yet palpable barrier. They never said it outright, but Marcus could feel it in the air, in the awkward words, in the watchful eyes. During the morning meeting, when Marcus began to introduce some changes to the department's workflow, the officers around the table showed no willingness to cooperate. One officer, a senior member named Davis, responded with a vague and dismissive remark when asked about unresolved cases. "This has been going on for a long time. It's not so easy to fix, sir." Davis's words were not just hesitant. They carried an underlying challenge, as if he was saying that Marcus, despite being the new police chief, did not have what it took to change what he called the system, a system that had existed for years. Suddenly, a quiet noise came from the back of the room, where a young officer sat, idly doodling on a piece of paper. He was a white officer with an unremarkable appearance, but with eyes that glimmered with arrogance. He broke the silence with a casual yet loaded remark. "Not sure if you plan on changing all of this, but I guess some things just have to be accepted." The entire room fell silent. Marcus immediately recognized that this was not just a meaningless joke. It was a veiled statement affirming the unchangeable nature of the department's deep-seated issues. These officers were sending a message. Even if you're the new police chief, don't expect to change this system. It has been in place for far too long. As the meeting ended, Marcus walked out of the room, his mind filled with unspoken questions. He knew this was not just about work, it was about respect and power. He had done nothing wrong, yet it seemed that those around him did not see it that way. In fact, as he exited the meeting room, a few officers standing nearby whispered among themselves, only to fall silent when they saw him. But Marcus was not one to be easily intimidated. He understood that this was only the beginning, and this underlying hostility would not stop. It had only just begun. That afternoon, as Marcus returned to his office, he came to an important realization. No matter how hard he tried to integrate, no matter how diligently and transparently he worked, racism would always exist in every corner of this society. Even if these officers masked their hostility under a veneer of respect, they would never easily accept a black man in a leadership position. But Marcus could not turn back. He could not retreat. He was the only one who could change this corrupted system, even though he knew that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles. And this underlying hostility was just one of many challenges he would have to face. He took a deep breath, looking out the window where the golden rays of the late afternoon sun were shining in, and he felt one thing. Only perseverance and courage could help him break through the invisible walls that these resistors had built. His story, this battle, was only just beginning. Marcus Grant knew that leading a police department like Riverside's was never going to be easy. The city was riddled not only with crime problems, but also a land where basic moral standards were eroding, where power and underground forces had existed for so long that they had become an integral part of the system. As he stepped into the role of police chief, he faced not only the criminals out there, but also powerful adversaries within his own ranks. And leading that pack was Cameron Hayes, a veteran officer who not only wielded underground power, but was also a symbol of conservatism and racism within the department. Hayes had been with the Riverside Police Department for many years, and he was someone everyone in the department respected. His disregard for rules and contempt for people like Marcus had become commonplace in the department. And Marcus, a black man, not only had to face simple expressions of racism, but also had to fight against the shadow of power that had lingered here for too long. That day, when Marcus was invited to a meeting with all the commanders in the department, he could clearly feel the tension in the air. The meeting room was deathly silent, and all eyes were on him. The people in the room didn't see him as a new leader, but as an outsider trying to challenge long-standing norms. They didn't say it, but their eyes spoke volumes. Among them, only one person made no secret of his opposition, Cameron Hayes. With his tall figure and cold eyes, Hayes stood at the back of the room, near the window, as if he were an integral part of the room's atmosphere. When Marcus walked in and sat down, Hayes's eyes didn't change, but there was a clear hint of mockery in his smile. "Welcome, Chief. Ready to face the job?" he said, his voice echoing in the room. No one answered, and Marcus knew that he wasn't just talking to him, but sending a message to everyone in the room. The meeting began, but from that moment on, Marcus felt the challenge coming from every word Hayes spoke. Everyone in the room, from senior commanders to veteran officers, was wary of the proposals Marcus made. He began to discuss the fundamental issues he wanted to reform, from increasing personal responsibility at work to reducing wasteful procedures in investigations. But his proposals were either ignored or deemed impractical. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense, and Marcus could clearly feel the discomfort of the officers as they saw their power being challenged. As the meeting moved on to discussing unsolved cases, Marcus made a key point. We need to review the cases that have been overlooked, especially those involving organized crime and signs of corruption within the police department. But as soon as he finished speaking, Hayes spoke up, his voice cold but sharp. I don't think this is the right time to make major changes. This city has been like this for a long time. You should accept the fact that not everything can change immediately. The room fell silent again. All eyes were on Marcus, waiting for his reaction. Marcus, not for the first time facing this challenge, but what confused him was the attitude of those around him. They didn't dare to speak up, but they stood with Hayes. They looked at him as if a black man couldn't understand the politics of the police. This made Marcus struggle with himself, whether he could convince them or whether he had to defeat them with his own strength. The meeting ended in a tense atmosphere. Marcus didn't achieve any results in that meeting, but he didn't leave in defeat. As he walked out of the meeting room, a young officer named Reyes, whom he had met a few times in previous investigations, looked at him with a worried look. Chief, I'm not sure this is how people will accept these changes. But I believe you can do it, Reyes said, her voice both worried and encouraging. That sentence gave Marcus a little peace of mind, but he knew that she was also just an outsider in this battle. The next day, when Marcus walked into his office, he noticed a report on his desk, and at the bottom of the report was a strange letter. Opening the letter, he found a vague warning from an unknown source. If you can't run this police department, bad things will happen. Those who oppose this system will pay the price. Marcus wasn't surprised, but a sense of danger rushed over him. This wasn't just a battle with external enemies, but also a battle within the police department itself. The people he thought would support him, the people who had stood behind him in difficult moments, had now become silent or distant. That feeling was no longer a surprise, but an awakening. Marcus realized that this was the moment he had to decide, to prove that he wasn't a weak police chief, and not to let anyone, including Hayes or anyone else in the department, dim his belief in the justice he had worked so hard to build throughout his life. The next day, when he entered the meeting room again, Marcus was no longer the black man that the white officers in the room could look down on. He stood up straight, his eyes no longer confused but with a firm determination. Hayes, still stood in his familiar position, but this time his eyes no longer shone with the same complacency as before. Marcus spoke strongly, without any doubt. You may not like me, you may not accept me, but I will not back down. Justice is not something that can be bargained. This war, which Marcus never wanted, had now begun. Marcus Grant had learned an important lesson during his time in office. Justice is not something easily won, and sometimes it comes at the cost of the life and reputation of the one who pursues it. That's why when he decided to confront corruption and racism within the Riverside Police Department, he faced not only external enemies, but also covert attacks from his own colleagues. People who were once comrades, but were now lurking shadows in a long-decayed system. By the third day since Marcus publicly announced changes in the police department, he realized that the people he thought would support him were standing by, watching from a distance, afraid to intervene. What Marcus hadn't anticipated was the persistence and strength of a system that had existed in the shadows for too long, where corruption and racism were not just part of the job, but also part of life. One way or another, the officers in this police department had learned to turn a blind eye to the truth, and they had no desire to change. That morning, when Marcus arrived at the police department, he received unexpected news. A package had been delivered to him at the gate. The package had no sender, just a hastily written letter, but the content was full of threats. If you don't stop interfering in the department's affairs, we'll show you what the price is. Despite preparing himself for challenges, the threats still caused Marcus some concern. He understood that there wasn't just one enemy in this department, but perhaps a group of people hiding behind veils, people who had been protected for too long. But Marcus was not one to be easily subdued. He walked in his office, feeling the tension increasing. Today, he was not just the chief of police of Riverside, but also the leader in a dangerous battle. A battle not only against criminals outside society, but also against the monsters hiding in police uniforms. With great determination, Marcus called for an emergency meeting with the commanders and key officers in the department. He wanted to make it clear that change was inevitable, and anyone who did not agree with justice would be held accountable. But as soon as the meeting began, an undercurrent arose. The older commanders, who were too accustomed to keeping silent about wrongdoing, just sat there, silent and without a word of rebuttal. Their eyes glanced at each other, avoiding Marcus, as if no one wanted to get involved in unnecessary matters. But there was one person who couldn't keep silent, and that was Cameron Hayes. He stood up, his eyes filled with anger, as if he couldn't bear the changes Marcus wanted to impose on the police department. I've heard what you said, but you have to understand, not everything can be changed with just a few words. This is Riverside, and here we have our own way of doing things, Hayes said, his voice echoing in the room like a punch. The others in the room didn't dare to say anything, just quietly looked at Marcus, waiting for his response. Marcus looked at Hayes, his eyes unwavering. He was too familiar with these kind of challenges. But today, there was no room for patience. If those ways of doing things include covering up wrongdoing, then I will never accept it. We are police officers not to protect the bad guys, but to protect justice, Marcus replied, his voice not loud, but clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. The room fell silent. Marcus knew that this battle was not just about power, but about fundamental values, about fairness and integrity. Just then, an officer walked into the room, his face full of worry. "Chief, there's trouble. We just received information that there's a big case, and one of the people involved is one of our officers." It was a real shock. The case the officer was talking about was no small matter. It involved an arms trafficking case between members of the police force and criminal organizations outside society. Marcus looked into the officer's eyes, feeling the seriousness of the situation. This was not just a simple corruption case, but a clear sign of the decay that had seeped into the law enforcement agency itself. Marcus immediately requested an investigation. But when he assigned tasks to the investigation teams, the officers were not very enthusiastic about the task. Some left immediately, while others, though not saying it, their eyes were not very bright either. Marcus knew that there was a covert cover-up in this department, and his request to investigate the case was an action that would certainly touch many people involved. The next day, when Marcus walked into his office, he received a call from Captain Harris. Harris was one of the people Marcus trusted most in the department. "Chief, I just received a report. One of the officers suspected of being involved in the arms trafficking case has been killed. He can't be the only one involved. I suspect that there's a cover-up network right in the department." Harris's words were another shock to Marcus. An officer had been killed for what he knew, and this proved that the people behind the case were not ordinary criminals, but people with power in this very agency. The price of justice is never cheap. Marcus understood that his career, his reputation, even his life, could be threatened by the decisions he would make. But he also knew that if he didn't act, corruption and racism would continue to grow like a cancer in the agency he was leading. At that moment, Marcus decided to make an important decision. The bad guys could not escape punishment. Corruption could not continue to run rampant in this police department. He called an emergency meeting with the commanders in the department, and this time, there was no room for hesitation. "We have to go all the way, no matter the cost. I will not tolerate anyone who betrays justice." I will make the final decision and take all necessary steps to change this police department. That was the strong statement Marcus made in that important meeting. That day, Marcus knew that justice would not come easily, but he was ready to pay the necessary price. Because only when he fought to the end could he change a long decayed system. As Marcus Grant delved deeper into the battle against corruption and racism within the Riverside Police Department, he realized that change could not be achieved alone. What he was fighting was not just the failure of a few individuals, but the failure of an entire system that had existed and been protected for decades. Those who opposed justice were not invisible ghosts, but people with names, power, and especially widespread influence within the department. Therefore, Marcus understood that he could not fight alone, and certainly could not change a system that had become deeply ingrained in the department's culture. In a moment when it seemed all doors were closed, a flame of hope began to ignite. That flame did not come from the powerful people in the department, but from someone Marcus least expected. Eva Turner, a young officer he had met in his early days at the department. Eva was a person with a strong passion for justice. She had joined the Riverside Police Department with the desire to help the community, but from her early days, she had faced the harsh realities of corruption and racism within the very agency she served. However, what made Eva different from other officers was her courage and desire for change. Unlike those who silently endured or turned a blind eye to wrongdoing, Eva had long felt that only action could change the system she was in. Marcus did not realize Eva's importance until she walked into his office one morning, her eyes full of determination. "Chief, I want to help you," she said, her voice serious. "I know this won't be easy, but I believe we can change this police department, no matter how difficult it is." Eva was not just a passionate young officer, but also someone who understood the inner workings of the police department better than anyone. She knew the hidden icebergs of corruption, knew who could be trusted, and who stood with the bad guys. Therefore, Eva's appearance in this battle was like a light in the dark. Both Marcus and Eva understood that if they wanted to change this system, they would have to seek allies outside the police department, but also build a force from the officers within. From the early days, Marcus had set a goal to find individuals who could stand with him, people who could face the danger and challenges that this battle brought. And Eva, with all her courage and understanding, became the most important ally in this battle. The following days became silent conversations between the two. Eva gradually helped Marcus build a secret team within the police department, young and brave officers, those who had not been corrupted by power and corruption, and most importantly, those who could help in the investigation and break up the underground networks in the department. Some of the people on this team were new officers, people who had not been affected by the corrupt culture in the department. They saw in Marcus a true leadership model, someone who could lead them through challenges and help them do the right thing. One afternoon, as Marcus and Eva were sitting in the office, discussing a new strategy to fight corruption, they received important information from one of the officers on their team. He reported that there was an ongoing arms trafficking case between some officers and criminal organizations. This was a case that, if not thoroughly handled, would have serious consequences for the police department, and not only that, but would also put Marcus's career in a dangerous situation. Those involved in this case were not just criminals outside society, but the very people Marcus was trying to clean up within the department. Marcus and Eva began a plan. They decided to launch a secret investigation campaign, gathering evidence without revealing their intentions. Eva took the lead in gathering information from internal sources, while Marcus directed all activities from a distance, using the team they had built. During the investigation, Marcus realized that the matter was more complicated than he thought. The people behind the arms trafficking were not simple criminals, but people with close relationships with officials in the department. These people had cleverly used their power to cover up their illegal activities. One day, as they were preparing to publicize the evidence about the case, a surprise came. One of Marcus's allies in the department, whom he trusted most, was arrested on charges related to the arms trafficking. This was a real shock, not only because he was an ally, but also because this betrayal showed the depth of corruption within the department. The feeling of pain and disappointment surged in Marcus's heart. But he knew that if he didn't continue this battle, if he didn't clean up the police department, he wouldn't be able to live with himself. The price of justice is not always fair, but Marcus understood that only when he was determined to go all the way could he salvage what was left of justice. Eva stood beside Marcus in those moments. She didn't say anything, but her presence was a great source of encouragement. Both looked at the battle ahead, knowing they had gone too far to turn back. And although things might get worse, they stood firm, continuing to fight to uncover the truth. This battle was not just a fight against corruption in the Riverside Police Department, but also a fight to restore faith in justice, in the values that Marcus had always believed in. Throughout that time, Marcus and Eva understood that no matter how many challenges, no matter how many enemies, they could never give up. Because in the most difficult moments, they had each other, and they had a team watching them, people who were willing to fight for justice, even if the price to pay could be everything. The Riverside Police Department was a cumbersome machine, full of hidden power and intricate relationships, where influential people sat on thrones and controlled everything from the shadows. Marcus Grant understood that when he decided to make changes, when he was determined to purge corruption and racism, he faced not only criminals outside society, but also an empire of power that had been firmly built over many years. And at the top of that empire was Cameron Hayes, a veteran police officer who not only had great influence within the police department, but also had deep relationships with powerful people in the city. He was the embodiment of a rotten system. And Marcus knew that to truly change things, he had to defeat Hayes, the leader of this corrupt empire. The feeling of tension and danger rose every day. After obtaining evidence of arms trafficking and misconduct by a group of police officers involved with organized crime, Marcus knew it was time to confront Hayes directly. He could not continue to fight in the shadows, could not back down while the truth was waiting to be revealed. Everything was too clear, and if he didn't act now, all his efforts would be in vain. That day, when the meeting began, the atmosphere in the room was thick and heavy. Marcus walked in, like a warrior standing before an uncompromising battle. He was not easily intimidated, but the challenging eyes from the officers in the room made him clearly feel that this was a battle not only about justice, but also about power. The people in the room were not just his colleagues, but also supporters of corruption, people who would do everything to protect their positions and interests. Hayes sat at the head of the table, his eyes cold and calculating. There was no surprise in his eyes when he saw Marcus walk in. He knew this day would come, and he also knew that this battle would not be easy. However, he did not show any worry. On the contrary, he showed absolute confidence, as if everything was in his hands. "Welcome, new chief," Hayes said, his voice full of sarcasm but still maintaining the necessary restraint. "I think we will have an interesting conversation today." Marcus stood before the table, unyielding. "Thank you, but I don't have time for these games. We will get straight to the point." He looked at every face in the room, from the corrupt officers to the young officers whom Marcus was still fighting to protect from this rotten system. He knew that no matter how difficult the battle was, he could not back down. After a few tense minutes, Marcus presented the evidence that he and his team had collected. Each photo, each recording, was a stone thrown hard at the faces of those who had long believed they could escape punishment. The officers in the room began to panic, some looking at each other worriedly. But Hayes remained calm. He did not show any surprise, but just smiled, his eyes lighting up as if he had been waiting for this moment. You think you can overthrow a system that has existed for decades with just a few photos and a few stories? Hayes said, his voice not loud but enough to make a strong impression. Justice is not something you can dictate with hastily assembled pieces. This police department has operated in its own way, and you cannot change that just by making a few eloquent speeches in front of everyone. Hayes's words were like a slap in Marcus's face, but they did not make him back down. He understood that this was not a battle between him and Hayes, but a battle between justice and corruption, between what was right and the evil that had existed for many years. Marcus looked at Hayes, his eyes full of determination, without a trace of fear. If we don't change, we will forever be accomplices to evil. I will not let that happen. Even if I have to sacrifice everything, I will do it. The price of justice is a price I am willing to pay. All the officers in the room began to fall silent, some looking at Marcus with skeptical eyes, others looking at each other, secretly exchanging thoughts in their heads. Hayes saw that clearly. He knew that what Marcus was doing was not only risking his position, but also his life. But he could not let someone like Marcus break the system he had worked so hard to build over many years. The atmosphere in the room seemed to freeze before an officer stood up, Davis, one of the authorities in the department. "Chief," Davis said, his voice heavy, "we cannot work with people like this. You know what we have faced, and if you continue, we will not only face change, but also a rift within our ranks." Marcus looked at Davis, but said nothing. He understood that everyone in the room had their own reasons, their own fears, but he could not let those fears stop him. "I understand," Marcus said, his voice soft but determined. "But I cannot turn back. We must face the truth. And if you do not stand for justice, then I will stand alone." The meeting ended in silence. The others did not dare to react strongly, but they knew that a change was beginning. This power struggle was not just a battle between Marcus and Hayes. It was a battle between those who were willing to face the truth and those who continued to hide it. And no matter how difficult things became, Marcus was ready to pay the price of justice. In the following days, Marcus felt the tension in every step he took. The price of justice was not just courage and action, but also perseverance and the ability to confront those who stood in his way, forces that had existed for a long time and were deeply rooted in the system. Riverside was not just a city, but a dark reflection of a corrupted mechanism, a mechanism in which power was not justice but oppression. While the battle with the criminals outside continued, Marcus increasingly felt that his own colleagues were the most formidable enemies. Police officers like Cameron Hayes, with their hidden power, not only held secrets but also controlled the network that protected wrongdoing. That was why, despite having clear evidence of corruption and arms trafficking or cases involving organized crime, Marcus could not find unity from those under his command. When Marcus decided to publicly expose the truth, he knew there would be strong reactions. This police department, rotten for more than a generation, could not easily accept change. Every step Marcus took faced covert attacks from the very people he thought he could rely on. The officers loyal to the system, despite seeing the decay, still sided with personal interests, and they would not give up easily. One morning, when Marcus entered his office, he noticed something was wrong. On his desk was a blank card, and signed with just a short message: "We don't give up. Don't test us." Marcus knew that these threats were not empty words. This was a sign from those who wanted to protect their power, those who would not tolerate anyone who dared to disrupt the stability of the system they had painstakingly built. As the hostility became more and more apparent, Marcus also realized that not everyone in the police department agreed with the wrongdoing. A few officers began to change their attitude, beginning to reassess what was happening. Eva Turner, Marcus's only ally throughout this battle, continued to hold on to her belief in justice. She was not just a passionate young officer, but also the first to stand up for the values that Marcus was trying to bring. The new officers, those who had not been corrupted by corruption, also began to quietly support him, even though they knew that every step they took could lead to danger. But despite the supporters, the battle was not easy. The forces in the police department were not easily subdued. One day, when Marcus decided to launch a public investigation into the corruption cases, he received shocking news again. Davis, one of the veteran officers he once trusted, had been arrested for involvement in a case. But what was noteworthy was that the one who arrested Davis was from Hayes's group. This proved that corruption was not just a problem of a few individuals, but of an entire system. The news of Davis's arrest spread quickly in the department, and immediately, Marcus felt a wave of strong opposition. People began to look at him with suspicion, and some began to avoid him. They did not want to be involved in the troubles that Marcus brought. However, Marcus could not turn back. He knew that this battle was not just his alone, but also for those who refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. Despite knowing that not everyone could stand with him, Marcus continued to act. He decided to invite Harris, one of the trusted commanders, to discuss the next steps. In a closed meeting between the two, Harris admitted that corruption had seeped into every corner of the police department, but he also asserted that if they did not act immediately, things would get worse. Chief, you need to prepare yourself. Those behind Hayes will not easily lose power. If we don't take strong action, the police department will never change. Marcus understood that he was standing at an important crossroads. This was not just a battle to protect justice, but also a battle to fight against a system that had existed for too long, a system that not only had power, but also the protection of powerful forces in society. But he also knew that if he did not act immediately, there would be no more opportunities to change. The next morning, when the meeting with the commanders began, Marcus entered with an unprecedented determination. He was no longer a man who only stood on theory, but a man who dared to face the truth and fight for justice. Today, I stand here not just to discuss, but to enforce justice. I cannot and will not stop. If you stand with me, we will change this police department. If not, I will fight alone, Marcus said, his eyes looking straight at every officer in the room. The atmosphere in a room was so tense that it could not be cut. The experienced officers, who were too accustomed to silence and fear, did not dare to refute Marcus. However, what they could not deny was the determination in his voice and eyes. They could no longer hide the truth. Marcus was ready to confront this system, and he knew there was no turning back. This battle, no matter how much blood was shed, no matter how many sacrifices were made, he would not give up. After the meeting, there was no applause, no unity. But there was one thing Marcus knew for sure. He had made the people in the Riverside Police Department rethink what they had done, and even if they did not stand with him at this moment, change would still come. Not because they chose it, but because he had decided that justice would be irreplaceable. The change in the Riverside Police Department was not a revolution sparked by powerful slogans, but a patient, silent, and arduous process. Marcus Grant had fought throughout the time to make the first changes, but he knew that was just the beginning. The system of corruption and racism had been built for too long, and to break it, he needed to go through difficult paths, facing challenges where every step could lead to failure or sacrifice. And even though he knew the road ahead was not easy, Marcus never intended to turn back. After the tense confrontation with Cameron Hayes, despite winning public debates and gaining the support of some colleagues, Marcus understood that things were just beginning. Hayes was not his only enemy, but just a symbol of a system that protected the bad guys in the department. Beneath the surface of confrontation, there were bigger, more sophisticated forces opposing him. But Marcus was no longer afraid. He had faced death as a police officer, but he had never felt so afraid of a rotten system. He knew that to change, he had to stand firm, not back down, and not let fear blind him. That day, when Marcus entered the police department, he noticed that the atmosphere in the room had changed. The eyes were no longer full of suspicion but wary, as if they were looking at him as an unpredictable threat. But what caught Marcus's attention the most was Eva Turner's attitude. She was not just an ally in this battle, but also the only one who had been by his side from the beginning. Eva, with all her perseverance and ideals, had become an indispensable companion on this difficult journey. "Chief, I just received information," Eva said as she entered the office, her voice soft but worried. "Davis was arrested while investigating the arms trafficking case. Things are being pushed to a more dangerous level. If we don't act quickly, the dark forces in the department will become even stronger." Eva's words were a strong wake-up call. Marcus looked into her eyes, his eyes full of determination. He understood that, even though they had made certain progress, opposition from underground forces still existed. Eva's courage, though seemingly fragile in the face of great challenges, was what helped him move forward with confidence. He knew that without her, this journey would be even more difficult. The battle in the police department was not just a struggle between right and wrong. It was a battle of faith, of what each person was willing to sacrifice to protect. Young officers, like Reyes, who had joined the department just to do the right thing, stood with Marcus, even though they knew it could put them in danger. They had witnessed the crimes that people in the department had covered up, and they could no longer turn a blind eye. These people, the uncorrupted officers, were the rays of light that helped Marcus continue to fight. But the battle did not stop with the officers in the department. There were clear signs that a large criminal network was secretly manipulating everything. The arms trafficking cases, the corruption cases, the dirty plots had been planned for a long time, and Marcus was the only one who stood up to face it. Criminals outside society could be arrested, but the forces inside the police department were hard to defeat. However, Marcus could not and must not stop. Every decision he made, every action he took, would affect the future of this police department and the people he swore to protect. One day, while investigating a case, Marcus received unexpected news. A senior officer, Captain Harris, whom he had always considered an ally, was killed in a surprise attack. This was not a normal criminal case. It had signs of revenge from those in the department. Those who had been behind the corruption and covered up crimes now did not hesitate to attack anyone who dared to oppose them. Harris's death was a big shock to Marcus, not only because he lost a trusted friend, but also because it was a clear sign that he was entering a battle with no turning back. Marcus had no time to grieve. He knew that if he did not act immediately, more people would have to sacrifice. Eva, despite feeling the loss, was always by his side, encouraging and supporting him. They decided to immediately expand the investigation, not only to find those behind Harris's death, but also to destroy the entire network of crime and corruption in the department. They could not rely on old methods. They began to mobilize new officers, those who had not been corrupted, and launched the most drastic campaign this police department had ever seen. Along with new allies, Marcus conducted a widespread investigation campaign, gathering information from secret sources and checking relationships in the department. This battle was not just about criminals outside society, but about cleaning up the police department itself, where everything had been distorted. The silent meetings, the secret investigations, all were carried out under strict supervision. Marcus knew that every step he took could be a big step back, but he had no choice but to continue. When they finally exposed the criminal network in the department, Marcus realized that this battle was not one that a person could win alone. It required support from everyone who was willing to stand for justice, from brave officers like Eva and Reyes to outsiders who were not afraid to stand up against evil. But the most important thing Marcus realized was that justice was never something that could be achieved easily. Every victory came at a price, and only when we never gave up could justice truly prevail. Marcus and Eva's footsteps continued forward, without stopping, without turning back, because they understood that this battle would never end. They could win each small battle, but the battle with evil, with corruption and injustice in society, was still long and arduous. But no matter what, Marcus was ready to move forward because he believed that only perseverance and courage could change a long rotten system. Marcus Grant's journey in the Riverside Police Department is not just a story about the struggle between good and evil. It is an arduous journey where every step is filled with blood and sweat. Every decision carries a price. But if we look deeply into this story, we can realize that the biggest lesson it brings is perseverance and determination in the fight for justice, despite facing seemingly insurmountable adversities. Marcus did not just fight for the change of an organization, but also for the belief in the ability of people to do the right thing, even if they sometimes have to pay a high price for that choice. The most important thing this story emphasizes is that sometimes justice does not come from resounding victories, but from steadfast and courageous actions throughout the journey. Marcus Grant is not a hero with extraordinary powers, but an ordinary man carrying a great responsibility and constant sacrifice. He stepped into an environment full of decay and injustice, where everything was against him, but he never gave up. He faced strong opposition from his own colleagues in the police department, people he thought would be his allies. But in this battle, Marcus realized that sometimes change must begin from the strongest people within the system itself, from those willing to make great sacrifices to make a difference. Throughout the battle, the challenges Marcus faced came not only from the outside, but also from his own internal struggles. Every step forward was a difficult choice, where each decision could make him sacrifice precious things, from friends to his own life. Corrupt police officers like Cameron Hayes represented those who did not want change. They protected personal interests, the privileges they had built over many years. However, Marcus never backed down, and this showed an important lesson. If you want to change, you must dare to face opposition and great challenges. You will never be able to change evil without paying a price. And when you decide to stand for justice, you will face challenges you never imagined before. One of the most powerful lessons Marcus learned throughout this journey was about the loneliness in the fight for what is right. The battle is not always supported by those around you. Sometimes you will have to fight alone, even accept loneliness because you know your choices are right. Young officers like Eva Turner or Reyes were important allies, but they could not always fully understand the sacrifices Marcus had to make. Their support was invaluable, but it was Marcus's perseverance, his determination to go all the way with his ideals. That was the deciding factor. And the important lesson here is that sometimes in life, you cannot expect support from everyone. You can only rely on yourself, on your own beliefs, to overcome difficulties and continue to fight. Another message this story brings is about accepting sacrifice. No one can change the world without giving up something. In this journey, Marcus not only lost friends, but also faced invisible dangers, threats from the system he was trying to change. Sacrifice is not always rewarded immediately, but every step Marcus took brought a little change, no matter how small. And the lesson here is, No action for justice is useless. Every sacrifice, big or small, has value, and eventually it will lead to change. It is a long process, but if you persevere, you will see the results. This story is also a reminder that power does not only come from control and strength, but also from fairness and respect. Those in power in the Riverside Police Department were used to controlling everything, protecting the bad guys, and maintaining the stability of the corrupt system. However, Marcus proved that true power is when you can change an entire system without resorting to violence or oppression. True power comes from courage, from the ability to do the right thing even when those around you disagree. And finally, this story affirms that each of us has the ability to change our lives and the society around us. But to do that, we must have the courage to face ourselves, to face what is wrong and unjust. Every step on the path to change can be difficult, but only when we do not give up, only when we continue to fight for what is right, can we achieve what we want. The lesson for Marcus Grant is a lesson about steadfastness, about courage, and a willingness to sacrifice for noble values. It is a journey that never stops, never turns back, no matter how many challenges there are.